northern kingdom. And the reason is going to be obvious once we get into what one of the prophets prophesied about what was going to happen because of Solomon's sin. This is also known by historians as the kingdom of brass, in contrast to the golden age that we talked about last week. And the reason for that is because shortly after the division, King Shishak goes in. Remember we talked about all of those, I think there were 300 shields, 3 pounds of gold apiece, something like $27 million worth of just ornaments up on the wall. And so he knew about those, and so he just, takes a search and rescue mission in and invades Jerusalem and steals all those golden shields, and Rehoboam didn't have the gold to replace them, so we had to replace them with shields of brass. And regardless of how you polish brass, it's never going to look like gold. So they were constant reminders to him and everybody else who came into this magnificent throne room, things were not like they were during the age of Solomon. And boy, that is for sure. Things are going to go from just, way up here to way down here very, very quickly. So this is the time of the torn kingdom. So we ended up class last time. Remember we had a lesson on Solomon's wisdom and his wealth and his women. And he's famous for his women. I can't imagine managing 700 wives and 300 concubines. Yes, Jim?
The wisest man in the world?
Yes, that's one of the greatest paradoxes is why he, of course, the reason is, remember we talked about it, don't think about this as being just his playthings or just a man who was just giving into every possible lust. This is not so much about sex as much as this is about what? Yes, foreign alliances, because in the ancient world, you would make these alliances and you would assure loyalty by marrying into the family and vice versa. And so that way you could make sure that each of you were going to keep the alliance because you had your relatives, sometimes your own children, in the royal house. You're not likely to invade another nation if you've got your daughter there in the nation you're invading. So that's the way they sealed all of these things. So think of this as just massive foreign alliances with every kingdom imaginable. And so in his wisdom, his earthly wisdom, he thought that this would keep his throne solid and his dynasty secure. Of course, the only alliance he needed was one, and who was that? Yeah, only thing he needed to trust in was Jehovah, but instead, he fell into the trap of trusting all these alliances. Yes, Les?
I read that and I wonder why 700? Were there 700 countries, kingdoms that he had to have alliance with?
I do not know. I do know that if you're a wife, you actually have some sort of claim to inheritance rights. If you're a concubine, you don't. That's really the only difference. But yes, there could have been some that just picked up along the way for whatever reason. But clearly, the main focus on this is all these foreign alliances. And it specifically says the very first move he made as king is to reach out to Egypt, the other powerful nation in the breadbasket of the world, and marry Pharaoh's daughter. And it talks about how he fell in love with her in particular and how she drew his heart away from God. And in order to please all these women, he starts bowing down to their idols. And we're going to talk in just a minute a little bit more about what he did to please them. And something that really surprises me was allowed even during the time when you had righteous kings that were mentioned as doing good, like David did. They still left this mount of corruption where Solomon had built all of these idols for all of his foreign wives. And more about that in a minute. Yes?
Did Solomon, I didn't remember seeing anything in there that Solomon actually worshiped there, or just that his wives did, and he tolerated it, but he didn't actually go up and burn incense and stuff, did he?
Well, for Solomon went after the Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. When it says he went after, think that's another way of saying he followed, he participated. And Solomon, verse 6, if you have your Bibles open, please notate verse 6. And Solomon did that which was evil in the sight of Jehovah, and went not fully after Jehovah, as did David his father. Then did Solomon build a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab. By the way, they are involved in children and child sacrifice. So, I mean, this wasn't just minor types of idolatry. And Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon, two that specifically were known for infant sacrifice. And so did he for all his wives who burnt incense and sacrificed unto their gods. So that verse sounds like he did it for his wives. But, certainly he's, up to no good. At verse 9, and Jehovah was angry with Solomon because his heart turned away from Jehovah. Think of all that Jehovah has done for him. And it says specifically that Jehovah loved Solomon, and Solomon loved Jehovah. But it's not going to last. And then it says, for turning away from Jehovah, the God of Israel, who had appeared unto him twice. Now, what references do we have here in some special way? I mean, God appeared unto Samuel and spoke to him. But it didn't happen very often. I mean, what a privilege to have God actually come and appear to you. Remember the first time he appeared unto Solomon? What was that about? Yeah, First Kings 3, he appears to him in a dream, and he's so pleased with him and all this, and says, okay, I'm going to give you one wish. And that's where a selfless wish turned out to get him even more than he had ever hoped for, because he asked for wisdom. And then in 1 Kings 9, 2 through 9, there's this long statement about God appearing to Solomon, and he's affirming him for building the temple, building God's house, wonderful dedication ceremony, calling the people to faithfulness. You can read more about that in Chronicles than in 1 Kings. But then God comes to him and says, now, if you'll be faithful to me and you'll maintain your faithfulness and you don't bow down to these other gods, then I'm going to make your house sure, just like I promised David. And, I'm going to bless you, and, you don't have to trust anybody else. But he says, if you, over time, give in to the cultural pressures and to, the tendency to bow down to idols and to commit sexual sins and those kind of things, then you're going to be punished for it. And so God's constantly warning them because he loves them and he doesn't want them to fall into these traps. But it didn't matter. He eventually gave in. So Israel's built on 7 hills, and down here at the bottom right hand, you'll notice you've got Mount Zion here, which is where they would worship, and then you would have the palace over in this area, and then this is the old small city of David. And so right out the window over the Kidron Valley is this mountain that everyone could see as you would approach Jerusalem, as you would travel to go up the hill to go to Mount Zion. And this is where he built all of these awful idols. And does anybody know how long this Mount of Corruption, with all these idols present for all to see, including all the tourists and anybody who would come there to worship God, how long that Mount of Corruption lasted? One of my favorite Old Testament characters, probably my favorite king, Josiah, right? And what does it say in 2 Kings 23 and verse 13? Somebody want to read that for us? 2 Kings 23 and verse 13. Whoever gets there first. Yeah, 2 Kings 23, verse 13. This is talking about Josiah's house cleaning, when he brings people back to the law and he gets rid of the high places. And what does he do with this? Go ahead, Todd.
Then the king defiled the high places that were east of Jerusalem, which were on the south of the Mount of Corruption, which Solomon Kirkland, king of Israel, had built for Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Sidonians, for Chemosh, the abomination of the Moabites, and for Milcom, the abomination of the people of Ammon.
Okay, so another reference to what we just read, all ties together. It just,
All three of them were up there?
yeah, and more. I mean, this place was just filled with these idols. And it just amazes me. Hezekiah was a good guy and a good man and is referred to in general as being a good king. He left that there. Jotham was a good king. Uzziah, till the very end of his life when he messed up. And he had a long reign. Jehoshaphat. What is wrong with these righteous kings? That they let that go. But Josiah was complete and thorough and said, enough. So this is going to last for hundreds of years. And I'll tell you what, it gives me hope that, to me, this is a pretty big oversight. Not that any of these righteous kings actually bowed down to these idols, but that they didn't get rid of them. And Josiah pleased Jehovah when he did. But in the overall evaluation of their lives as kings, they're going to be referred to as righteous kings like David. So you don't have to be perfect to be righteous. You can have areas where you mess up, maybe blind spots. And God's got grace. And these people are still referred to as righteous kings in spite of the fact they were not as thorough in restoring true worship as was Josiah. So I'm just amazed why in the world they would keep that there. But they did. And so it's really sad. And so this is what obviously brings the downfall of Solomon. And it says, verse 11, wherefore Jehovah said unto Solomon, for as much as this is done of thee, thou hast not met my covenant and my statutes, I will rend the kingdom from thee and will give it to thy servant. Notwithstanding, in thy days I will not do it for David thy father's sake. So he's going to allow Solomon to stay on the throne and die of natural causes. But even before he dies, things start to unravel. In 1 Kings 11, 14 through 25, it talks about revolts in Edom and Moab and Syria. And so think about the Soviet Union back in the 1990s. They started becoming weak. And the first thing that happened is they lost all the Eastern Bloc and Eastern Europe and all these rebellions and all of those countries. And they pretty much fell without hardly a shot being fired. I mean, it was amazing. And so all these kingdoms round about that were paying tribute to Solomon saw the weakness, and it says this is of Jehovah, that Jehovah caused these rebellions and put this in the heart of these people. And then there's a fellow by the name of Jeroboam who was an important person. In fact, it says, the man Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor, and Solomon saw the young man that he was industrious, and he gave him charge over all the labor of the house of Joseph, over the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. But it says that, verse 26, and Jeroboam the son of Nebat, he also lifted up his hand against the king. So he rebels against Solomon. Solomon hears about it, seeks to have him killed. He has to flee. On his way to Egypt, where King Shishak is, he takes refuge eventually. But before he has to flee, literally fleeing for his life, because he's been an insurrectionist, the prophet Ahijah comes to him. And it's really neat. What does he do? He comes with this brand new garment. And to give us the visual, what does he do in front of him to make the point? Yeah, he takes this garment and he rips it into 12 different pieces. And he says, because of Solomon's sin, and because you've been this mighty man of valor, Jehovah is going to give you 10 of these tribes. And the only one that's going to be left is Judah. In fact, it says here, he said to Jeroboam, take thee 10 pieces, for thus saith Jehovah thy God, behold, I will rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and will give 10 tribes to thee. But he shall have 1 tribe for my servant David's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, where I have put my name. Now, you may have wondered, as I did when I first read this, okay, you got 12 stripes, 12 tribes. He gets 10. Judah's only promised 1. What happened to the other strip? What does that represent? Well, 1 Kings 12 and verse 21 tells us, and when Rehoboam was come to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen men. So Benjamin is kind of like a border tribe. It's right there between Israel and Judah. And sometimes they side with Judah, and sometimes they side with Israel, most of the time with Judah. And so even though the only one that God is promising the house of David is Judah, Benjamin is going to be allowed to side with them as well. Now remember, because of the civil war during the time of the judges, it wasn't a very big tribe, because they almost got wiped out for a civil war. But you'll notice it says consistently throughout here, Judah and Benjamin. Yes?
One question I kept raising in my mind when I was reading this, it says 10 tribes and 1 for Judah. The 12th one, what happened to the 12th one?
That's what I just tried to answer. It's Benjamin. In other words, Benjamin is allowed to also go with Judah. And so, you know, it's not like he had to be promised that. And there are going to be times where Benjamin's going to side with the North in some of their civil wars, so it's not forever. But you also have the situation of the Levites. And all the Levites wind up going south or staying south. Remember, the Levites were given 48 cities and their suburbs. They were spread throughout the entire land. And but during times of apostasy, where no one pays any attention to the Levites, and during the time of Jeroboam, they're going to appoint priests that aren't Levites, and so they would flee to the south. So virtually all the Levites are also in Jerusalem, but they aren't much help during a war. Why is that? Because Levites are exempt from military service. They were supposed to be serving the Lord, and they were not to be a part of the military. It's one of the reasons why I'm a conscientious objector. I don't want to put myself in a position to take another human life, but that's a whole other issue. So Jeroboam then flees to Egypt to King Shishak, and he stays there until he hears that Solomon has died. So it's a very simple statement here in 1 Kings 11, 42 and following, and the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his stead. And what kind of a guy is Jeroboam going to be? Headstrong, insolent, and an idolater. He's wicked. Not too surprising given what he witnessed in his father Solomon, right? And what do you think it was like growing up in the royal house of Solomon with all these foreign women who had a special place for them to worship all their idols?
Who's next in line?
I mean, would have been fascinating to have been raised in that royal house. And when he's got a big decision to make, he seeks the counsel of the other royal spoiled brat kids that he grew up with in the royal house of Solomon. And they're going to give him some terrible advice, but I'm jumping ahead. I just want to say that some of the most beautiful things in all the Bible are in Proverbs, and especially the first part, Proverbs 1 through 3, and he says, my son, listen carefully to my instruction, and hold it closely to you, around your neck, and fear Jehovah and trust your mother, just wonderful stuff. It was said to Rehoboam at a time when Solomon was faithful. And so he winds up being like his dear old dad and rejecting all of that amazing wisdom. So I just find that interesting, because you read that and you forget who Solomon's talking to. Kind of sad, really. So obviously we must not just be hearers of the word, but doers. And so you would think that he would say, okay, I'm Solomon's successor, come to the city of Jerusalem, where the king is and where the royal palace is and where the temple is, and declare me king. But he doesn't do that. He has everybody go up to Shechem. Now, where have we run across Shechem before? Where does the nation go to kind of unite together every 7 years if they're faithful? Yeah, to Shechem. Remember, I like to think of Shechem as sort of like the belly button of Palestine. You look at it on a map, it's just right here. And it's a little area there that's like a valley. Remember, you got Ebal on one side and Gerizim on the other, and all the people divide up, and they have this huge echo chamber, and they affirm upon themselves the blessings of the covenant, and they read the book of Deuteronomy together as a nation. So that's how they unite together. So he goes to Shechem. I think that's probably because Rehoboam knew he needs to unite the nation. He doesn't expect them to all come down to him. He goes to Shechem, of all places. And interestingly enough, when Jeroboam needs a new capital, what's the first capital of Israel? Shechem. So he goes up there and he meets with all the people, and there's some negotiating that needs to be done. What request did the people make in 1 Kings 12 and verse 4? Yes. Thy father made our yoke grievous. Now, therefore, make thou the grievous service of thy father and his heavy yoke, which he put upon us, lighter, and we will serve thee. Man, these taxes are killing us. You know, this very serious conscripting of our young men and putting them into service, and all these, man, just supporting all his wives has been tough. You know, Solomon never lifted a finger. You know, he was the king sitting on the throne. We had to serve him and do all this stuff. And so they said, just lighten up and we'll serve you. And by the way, what prophecy does this fulfill? When they first cried out for a king during the time of the judges, and Samuel says, no, you don't want that. And they said, no, yes, we do. We need a king to fight our battles for us. And do you remember what he says in 1 Samuel 8, 10 through 18? He says, I'm telling you, if you get a king, a worldly king, he's going to tax you to death. He's going to take away your freedoms. He's going to put your sons in the military. He's going to, take away your fields and just use them for his own use. He's going to be a tyrant. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Do you really want this, dictator? And they go, yeah, we do. He goes, okay. So, we were kind of bragging about Solomon earlier and how wise he was and how rich he was and, all this harem and all this stuff. But Deuteronomy had said, if you do have a king down the road, and it's God's plan that you eventually have kings, he says, he should not multiply his wives, nor should he have an abundance of silver and gold. So Moses said, you don't want a king like that. And that's exactly what they got. And so the people come and say, Uncle, we don't want a king like that. I want to say, why didn't you listen to Samuel when you had the chance, right? So at any rate, he says, let me give me a few days to think about this. Let me give me 3 days to think about this. And they says, okay, we'll come back in 3 days and we'll figure out what to do. So who did Rehoboam take counsel of? Well, first it looks like he went to the elders. And what did they tell him in 1 Kings 12, 7 and 8? If you don't want to have these people rebel, you lighten their load. You speak softly to them. You lower their burdens. You be reasonable here, and you can keep the nation together. And then he goes, okay. And then he says the young men that he grew up with, the spoiled, entitled brats that grew up as royalty. So what do these spoiled rich kids say? Yeah, you tell them, hey, what are you to question me? And he uses some very fervent language here. Let me see here. He says in 1 Kings 12 and verse 11, and now whereas my father did lay upon you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips. I will chastise you with scorpions. The idea is, you better not question me because, man, you think my dad was bad. I'm going to really give it to you. Is that a very wise thing to do? No. Now, I have noticed over the years that when people are teenagers, they tend to not want to talk to an adult who's been there, done that. I got to talk to one of my peers, or maybe a lot of my peers, because they can understand how I feel. They know what I'm going through. And I don't mean any disrespect. They're not any wiser than you are because they haven't been down this road. And a lot of times it's just a pooling of ignorance. I mean, honestly, why don't you go and try to talk to somebody you know cares about you and that will give you some good advice that's older and it's got a little bit more mileage on them. Maybe they can help you avoid some of the mistakes that they made. But I just marvel at how people tend to want to talk to their peers instead of respecting the counsel and the wisdom of some older people who maybe have learned a few things over the years. There are some things the years teach that the days never can. It's just the way it is. Yes, Pat.
Well, in the New Testament, we're told the older women are supposed to
Teach the younger women, right.
you know,
Titus 2. Yeah, I think it's an untapped resource. And it's amazing how rare it is for a younger person to get with an older person, specifically because they want a mentor. They want a counsel. They almost always want to have their peers. It's just human nature, not really very wise. So that's okay, though, because it was God's plan to split the kingdom and to take it away from the house of Solomon, right? And he should have lost the whole thing, but God's got to keep his word to who? David. Remember 2 Samuel 7? I'm going to set your kingdom up and your throne up forever. And so he's going to allow the house of David, the Davidic line, to remain in place ultimately until Jesus comes in some ways. He's going to suspend the Davidic kings because of Judah's sins later on, but we're jumping ahead. But so what does Rehoboam do? He messes up, follows the advice of the younger. And so they leave, the 10 tribes make Jeroboam king. So he'd already, been an insurrectionist, and God apparently had, through Ahijah, said, yeah, you can be king of the north. But he was hoping that Jeroboam would be faithful because he tells Jeroboam that if you keep my commandments and keep my statutes, you'll have a sure dynasty. You'll have a sure throne, just like I promised David. So he hoped that Jeroboam would be faithful. But right out of the gate, he's not. And it's just so amazing. By the way, what averted a civil war? Because Rehoboam's got a pretty good army of 180,000 people. And he's been the king that is, at least Solomon and his family have been there with the official military and all that. So he had a lot more people in at least a trained army. So, he's going to call his army together. But God sends Shemaiah in 1 Kings 12, 22 through 24, and says, you speak to Rehoboam and you speak to all the people, and you tell them that this thing is of me, that I want this division. I don't want a religious division. I still expect everybody to come to the Temple of Jerusalem to worship. But because of Solomon's sin, this is of me. So don't fight this. So they don't. So they go, okay, so the kingdom splits and there isn't a civil war. So now you got the 10 tribes, and then you got Judah, most all the Levites, and Benjamin. Okay? And it's not any time at all after this that King Shishak comes up. By the way, that's where Jeroboam had stayed with King Shishak, so he knew about all the shields. So he rushes in and takes all those shields away, $27 million worth of gold. But what is Jeroboam afraid of? There's no civil war. He got this pretty easily. It's of Jehovah. The promise of Jehovah, I'll be with you. But in his mind, what's he afraid going to happen? Yeah, that every time, remember there's 3 pilgrimage feasts, that every time they go down to Jerusalem to worship God in the temple, that they're going to want to be united again with Jerusalem and all of that. And so how does he keep the people from going to worship in Jerusalem, which is now sort of enemy territory? Yeah. So he decides, okay, calls all the people together, says, it's too hard for you to walk all the way down from Dan and Ephraim and Nebulun, all these different tribes. It's too hard for you to walk down to Jerusalem. It was quite a trek. So instead, we're going to have our own places of worship in this new nation in Dan and Bethel. So here's a map. Dan was at the very top of the nation, and Bethel was just right there on the border. And, it's kind of like from sea to shining sea, from north to south. So I've got these 2 locations. Whatever is most convenient, I've got it set up for you. And I have a whole sermon I sometimes preach on, it's too hard for you, where the devil's trying to get us to focus on convenience instead of conviction, and try to make sure you do things right instead of just what's easy. So that's always been the devil's work, and that's what Jeroboam is doing here. And so the people don't put up much of a fight, apparently, which is pretty sad. And where do you think they got the idea to worship a golden calf? Where have they worshiped a golden calf before in their history? When Moses was up on Mount Sinai. How did that work out for them? You ever watch Dr. Phil? I love it. The people are, talking about all these things. He always says, how's it working out? How's that working out for you? In other words, maybe you ought to try something different, because what you're doing now is not working. They should have learned from history. Hathor was the main Egyptian goddess of Egypt. Remember, Jeroboam had been down in Egypt in exile, and he'd probably got reintroduced to this idea, the holy cow. And so the people go ahead and start worshiping the golden calf. And by the way, I want to make something really clear. He doesn't tell them, worship the golden calf instead of worshiping Jehovah. Maybe that would have been too big a bridge to cross. He says, behold the gods that brought you out of Egypt. In other words, he says, we're going to worship Jehovah through this golden calf. They're still worshiping Jehovah, so keep that in mind. They're just doing it in a false way. People act like, well, if I got the right God, that's all that matters. No, you have to worship the right God in the right way that he's told us to act. And none of this, it's too hard for you stuff. If you're serious about being a disciple and being faithful. Now, I want to back up here. We've got just about 8 or 9 minutes. This is really important. Does anybody know what the term syncretism means? You familiar with that?
That's the merging of.
Yeah. It's the blending. It's literally a word that means to blend in the original language. So Canaanite syncretism is where you take some of the true religion and then you blend it with the idolatrous false religion around you. I mean no disrespect, but that's really what Catholicism is. It's Christianity and Judaism blended all together with paganism, and you come up with something completely foreign to what you read about in the New Testament. It's just true. Now, they still give lip service to worshiping God? Yeah. But praying to Mary? Mariolatry? Indulgences? Paying in advance so you can sin and just pay it off early with money? Are you kidding me? I could go on and on, but if you study the development of Catholicism, it was taking things that were pagan. December 25th was a pagan holiday. And so everyone was used to worshiping Bacchus, the goddess of wine, on December 25th, the winter solstice. And so we'll just change it to the birthday of the Son of God. Well, 316 AD, we'll just change this pagan holiday to a Christian holiday. And we'll tell everybody it's Christ's birthday. We don't know when Christ was born. But it doesn't matter. We'll make it coincide with this pagan festival so the pagans can more easily convert to Christianity. Well, that's really what's going on here. There are 3 stages. The golden calf, they're still monotheistic. In their minds, they're worshiping God through the golden calf. Right God, wrong way. And throughout 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it talks about the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, in which he made Israel to sin. And it's this worshiping God through the golden calf. And by the way, these altars, these false altars at Dan and Bethel, they're going to last and remain in place until whom? Josiah, my hero. He goes up over the border and he messes up and destroys even the golden calf of the north. Man, what a great dude, huh? All right, so golden calf. And then you have Baal worship, which is the god of Phoenicia. That's Jezebel, where she came from. See, they wanted to have an alliance with Phoenicia, so Ahab marries the daughter of Sidon, the king of Sidon. And so it's polytheistic. So you worship the golden calf, or Jehovah through the golden calf, and then you worship Baal too, the storm god. But Jezebel said, no, I don't want them to worship Jehovah and Baal. I want them to worship Baal only. And so they go from being monotheistic to polytheistic to ultimately they go to forsaking Jehovah completely. And that's where God says, I'm long-suffering, but I'm not that long-suffering. Even I've got my limits, and that's when he plans to take them into Assyrian captivity. They'd rejected God completely. Why should he continue to do anything for these ingrates? And so that's the kind of the broader lesson we see here. And we need to be very much on guard against any kind of syncretism where you take cultural things and you bring them into the Lord's church and try to make excuses to kind of fit in with the culture. And when you got a Catholic church, as I saw in the news recently, putting a rainbow pride flag out front of their service, that's syncretism. It's blending the world's immorality and making it a part of your worship and trying to make it holy when it's the exact opposite. It just breaks my heart. This is where you're polytheistic. You worship God, small g, but not God, capital G. And that's what we're witnessing. That's what this study of 1st and 2nd Kings tells us. Now, there's 5 main differences between the North and the South. There's the surrounding culture. The North is more cosmopolitan. They're right up there next to Phoenicia. They have all the ivory and all the different things that they have from merchants, and the South is more kind of hillbillies. They're up in the hill country and they're isolated. And the internal culture of the north, it's urban, it's richer. They're more likely to be pressured to be like everyone else, while the south is more agricultural and more pastoral and poorer. And in the Bible, the cities go corrupt first, and they send the prophets from the country to go and prophesy against the cities, because usually it's the cosmopolitan, with it, wealthier areas that turn away from God first. Interesting. And then the political. The north is very unstable. You're going to have 9 dynasties. It's all assassination, wipe out this house, start another one. What difference does it make? Because there isn't any promise like there was with David. So it's more of a military coup kind of a situation. Think Banana Republic. And the south is stable because everybody recognized the king had to stay in the Davidic line. So how many dynasties do you have in Judah? 1. How many are you going to have in the north before they're taken into captivity? 9 different dynasties. And almost all of them switched because of violence. The kingship. Again, the north is non-dynastic. They're more just military dictatorships. While the south is dynastic and it's theological. And God's going to protect the line of David. And of course, the north is into golden calf and Baal worship, while the south is poor, pastoral, but more faithful. And they're going to have 5 righteous kings, 6 if you include Uzziah. So understanding the difference between the north and the south is pretty important. Looks like that's the bell. Let me just say this before we dismiss. When you study 1st and 2nd Kings, you need to realize that they are narrated separately but together, and that the reigns of the southern kings are dated according to the northern kings and vice versa. So they don't have a system like we do, AD, BC, so the only frame of reference is the years of the reign of the king in the north and the king in the south. And I'll show you a little bit more how that works next week. Yes, ma'am.
One little point.
Okay.
Christians sometimes pick up the language that they hear about, and you sometimes hear Christians say, "Holy cow." We don't need to be talking about holy cow.
But it's okay for the teacher to reference it. That's where that comes from, right?
That's okay. But
Okay, thank you. Yeah, all right. Yeah, that's where the holy cow comes from. It's from that idea. All right, thank you all very much. Hope you're enjoying this study. There's a lot of wealth of information here, a lot of practical lessons. So we'll pick up here next with the reading. If you'll look through the handouts, you'll start seeing the kings of the north and the kings of the south, and a lot of good background information with your handouts. Anybody here need a notebook of handouts? Everybody good? Okay, thanks for being here. And whatever you do, the lady says, don't talk about holy cows, only holy God.